Hi, good evening. I'm Alex Drizzoli. I'd like to welcome you to week 3 of Introduction to the Middle Way. First, I'd like to just review what we covered last week. So first, as we think about what it takes to accomplish enlightenment, we realized that enlightenment is a result of elimination or a result of absence, we call Drelj. So we think of our path as being something like cleaning a window. Right? There's different kinds of dirt on our window, which we want to get rid of. And in particular, there are two kinds of defilements or obscurations, which are denzin, which is the clinging to true existence, and tenzin, which is clinging to marks or characteristics. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. In particular, we can also divide it as clinging to the self of phenomena and clinging to the self of the person. Now, actually, they're all subcategories of the self of phenomena because the person is just one of many phenomena, but we divide it into two for the purposes of differentiating between the path that is common to all Buddhist schools and then the Mahayana path. And as we saw last week, that's a little bit like the difference between the Shravaka Arhats and the Bodhisattvas with the example of the baby prince and the minister. So denzin is when we cling to this story of self as being real, as truly existing. And when we believe that, it leads to emotion, it leads to action, leads to the three poisons that cause samsara. Both in the moment, so for example, we can become reactive, we can get triggered emotionally, the classic amygdala reaction, but also over time. So if we cling to the notion that a good life is based on wealth or fame or popularity, if we believe these things truly exist, then that will guide our path, that will guide our life choices. And these types of clinging to true existence, they can be unaware. So for example, many of us aren't even aware that we have a story of a truly existing self. But in other cases, we are aware of them. We hold our stories deliberately. So this might be true of political beliefs, campaigns, or perhaps if you think of people who chose to fly an airplane into the Twin Towers in New York, right? Clearly you've got to believe a view fairly strongly for it to guide your behavior in that way. And when we overcome all the clinging to true existence, all the denzin, all the different kinds, that's termed nirvana, right? Because at that point, there's no longer any reactivity, any more of the three poisons in either the short term or the long term, which means there's no more suffering. Now, on the Bodhisattva path, we wish to go further, right? Because even after you've accomplished nirvana, you still have tenzin, right? You still have clinging to some kind of marks or characteristics, some kind of dualism, some kinds of stories or labels. So even though you don't think they're truly existing, you still have these differentiations, these characteristics. And when you've overcome the tenzin, then you have no more dualism, no more phenomena, and that is considered complete enlightenment. And just to be clear, when we say no more phenomena, it doesn't mean a blankness. It doesn't mean some kind of blowing out of a candle. It means that these dualistic thoughts, concepts, language, the way we normally draw boundaries around what we consider a phenomenon, those no longer exist. And as we saw in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, so we deconstruct all of the form, but at the same time, emptiness is form. Right? So in the Vajrayana, we talk about the three kayas. Right? We still have manifestation. It's just that it's no longer dualistic. And at that point, as we saw last week, it becomes very difficult for us to talk about it. Words fail us. The only real way forwards at that point is our practice. Now, the other thing we touched on last week, and we'll talk a little bit more this week, is two kinds of ignorance. And that's not the same as these two kinds of clinging to the self of the person, the self of phenomena. So these two kinds of ignorance are innate ignorance and imputed ignorance. So the innate ignorance is also sometimes known as co-emergent ignorance. It's sort of forgetting or losing one's mindfulness and awareness. And we purify that through our practice. Whereas the imputed ignorance is what we purify by logic and reasoning. And that's all the stories, the marks, the tenzin, the denzin. Right? So this is where we establish the view that none of these things exist truly. But even though at that point we may have refuted the labeling, we can't actually get rid of the ignorance until we practice. So as we said before, yes, it's very important for us to establish the view, to understand that these labels that we've been clinging to are not actually truly existing labels. But even once we have that intellectual understanding, we then need to practice. Okay, so this week, now that we know what we want to do is to deconstruct this imputed ignorance, all these different stories and wrong views, we're going to ask a little bit about, well, what is a view? I'm going to explore how views connect to stories. And remember, as we said in previous weeks, it does matter because our views, our mindsets, they drive our behaviors, right? So a view is extremely important on the path. And in particular, this week, we're going to look at views in terms of how we explain arising. And it turns out that all of our opponents have origin stories to explain why things exist in the world. So that's what we're going to be deconstructing. And in particular, we're going to take Nagarjuna's approach of breaking up these different forms of origin story or arising into four types, whether things arise from themselves, from other things, from both, or from neither. We're also going to touch on the debate a little between the Prasangika and the Svatantrika Madhyamika schools. So the question there is, can we just show how our opponent's views fall apart by pointing out contradictions, or do we actually need counter-arguments and views of our own? So we'll talk about that a little as well. So in terms of the actual text, we're going to cover from verse 8 to verse 44 of chapter 6. So the first few verses from 8 to 13, we're going to be refuting the Samkhya. That's one of the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools, which held a belief in arising from the self. Then verses 14 to 21, we're going to be refuting truly existing other arising. And here our opponents will be some other Buddhist schools. And then actually most of the rest of the verses from 22 to 44, that's going to be responding to objections from our opponents. And in particular, Chandrakirti, as you know, he does not hold to any views of his own. He doesn't believe in any views. In fact, he says we should refute all views, which then leads to an interesting dilemma, because if indeed our behaviors are governed by views, how are we supposed to live in the world if we don't have any views? And here Chandrakirti's approach is to accept the conventions of ordinary people. So yes, he knows we still need to attend to the basics of health, money, shelter, relationships, friendships. But he wants to do this without getting caught in attachment to samsara. And there are many famous stories of masters, great masters, who ended up just doing very ordinary jobs in the world, seemingly insignificant and unimportant. Rinpoche himself famously taught at one point that a good job for people in the world is to become an electrician or a plumber. And he was there being just very practical, what kinds of jobs can provide you with a steady income. And actually, as we head into the age where artificial intelligence is going to start replacing workers, that may not be bad advice, actually, because it turns out that electricians and plumbers are going to be among the last jobs to be automated. Anyway, we'll come back to all of that in week 8. But this notion of accepting the conventions of ordinary people, we don't want to be weird, right? We don't want to stick out. There's no point in, if we're trying to ask someone for a glass of water in using different language, people won't understand what we're talking about. Right? If we want a glass of water, we should ask for a glass of water. As Rishi said, the advice for living in the relative world is always don't burn other people's noses. It's a Tibetan saying. But it has this idea of, don't be outrageous for the sake of it. Don't do things just for the sake of not fitting in. And here our opponents will say, well, Chandrakirti, you say you accept ordinary people's views, but they believe in other arising, right? So why don't you? It's true, in the normal world, we tend to say that a cause and an effect, they're two separate things, and the cause is other than the effect. So how will he answer that? Right? So a lot of what we'll talk about today is the two truths, right? Distinguishing the ultimate and the relative truth, distinguishing the view and the path, and really two different kinds of views, right? The views of the ultimate truth, yes, that is all around the lack of any kind of extremes, going beyond all extremes, as we saw last week. But in the relative truth, our view will be, as Chandrakirti says, just holding to ordinary conventions. And this has got nothing to do with being attached or clinging to the self of the person, the self of phenomena, just the things that are necessary to function in the world. For example, driving on the left rather than driving on the right, asking for a cup of tea rather than a glass of water. We need to make these practical distinctions to function. And this is particularly important for those of us on the Mahayana path because we aspire to be bodhisattvas who are going to help sentient beings. And we can't help someone or teach someone unless we understand their conventions. If you think about a classic example would be, the history of so much development aid in Africa and other such countries. So often it didn't work because the donors just did not understand the conventions of the recipients of their aid, right? So it was inappropriate technology, things didn't work. There's a very similar kind of idea here, right? We need to work with conventional truth as a means of communication, a means of understanding, and to do that, as the saying says, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, we need to understand what do the ordinary people think. And in particular, they don't talk philosophically, right? They'll say, please pass me a glass of water. They won't say, please pass me a set of H2O molecules, right? So, and likewise, when we tell stories in the ordinary world, we do so very naively and randomly. It's not really a structured philosophical approach, right? We might sometimes believe in theories of arising from self, right? We might say, hey, this is a picture that I painted. Or we might sometimes have stories that believe in arising from others. We might say, oh, my boss gave me some tough feedback on my work. Right? So much of actually what is going on in our everyday world is about stories, right? We'll see this as we talk today. But if you think of so many of our problems in ordinary life, they're around independence versus codependence, boundaries, secure and insecure attachment, accountability, helpful and unhelpful mindsets and narratives. And yes, we can certainly work with a therapist or with a coach, but we can also apply the view. So that's what we're going to spend today talking about. Right? A lot of today is going to be then refuting the Samkhya, the Buddhist schools, and then talking about the two truths. So as in previous weeks, just to connect this to the hero's journey once again. In fact, one was the setup, the context. The first week was scene one, starting in the ordinary world, some kind of catalyst, the possibility of something exciting, the journey to enlightenment. And usually in Act 1, one hears the theme of the story and there's some kind of resonance, but we don't really understand it yet. We don't have enough experience or enough context. In Scene 2, which was last week, we start to face resistance. We start to find the reasons that, yes, it might seem like a good idea, but we don't have the time, we don't understand it. We have all kinds of fears and excuses and reasons not to proceed. So then we have to gather our resolve, really make the case for the journey and overcome our fears. And then that transitions into Act 2, which is where we begin today. Right, that's now the main journey, the adventure begins. So now we'll start to meet the bad guys. We'll engage in and overcome challenges. We'll start to become seasoned adventurers rather than the naive beginners we were before. So this week is really leaving behind our familiar world and going into this world of analysis, this world of logic and philosophy, where we start to question reality, where mountains are no longer mountains. We start to look at our world rather than just work within the world. Nice language for this that Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Kennedy School uses. He talks about the difference between the balcony and the dance floor, where if you're on the dance floor, what you notice is just the people in your immediate surroundings. You don't really have much context or overview of the whole. But if you leave the dance floor and go up onto the balcony, then you can observe the whole thing. You can see what's going on. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to meet our first opponents, and we're going to start to distinguish right and wrong views. And actually in the hero's journey, at the beginning of the second act, you usually find what's called the B story in movie scripts. There's usually some discussion about the theme or some nugget of truth that takes place between the main character and some kind of love interest, and that gets resolved in Act 3. So if you think, well, who might be the love interest in this story? Well, for Chandrakirti, his real love is compassion for all sentient beings, and in particular for ordinary people, right? So I might propose that our love interest here is going to be the cowherd. And this will come up today and throughout the rest of the weeks, and certainly at the end in week 8. We'll take all of our understanding of the view and bring it back into our practice in the world. One other way we can think about where we are on the journey is the classic presentation of the 5 paths. It's another Buddhist structure. These are the paths of accumulation, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and the path of no more learning. And the first path, the path of accumulation, starts, really that's Act 1, right? We have a strong desire to overcome suffering, and then we decide to leave behind our ordinary lives. So on the Theravada path, that might be renunciation. On the Mahayana path, that's taking the Bodhisattva vow and starting to embark upon the path of entering bodhicitta. And then that moves into the second path, the path of preparation. And here we do 2 things, right? We start to practice in our meditation, and we really then establish the view and then start to practice the view. So this is what we're doing right now. The path of seeing, that is the first bhumi, when we actually realize emptiness for the first time. The path of meditation then is the 2nd to the 7th bhumis, where we're purifying and removing our tenzin. And then the last 3 bhumis are the path of no more learning. And also, as in previous weeks, I'd like to cite the relevant verse from the 10 Bulls. And this one is perceiving the bull, the 3rd one of the 10 bulls. And usually it's intended to refer to our first real experience of our minds, the nature of our minds. But we could also apply it, perhaps in this case, to our first real experience of applying the methods of refutation. actually engaging in logic and reasoning and observing and experiencing how it works. So here's the verse. I hear the song of the nightingale. The sun is warm. The wind is mild. Willows are green along the shore. Here no bull can hide. What artist can draw that massive head, those majestic horns? And the comment. When one hears the voice, one can sense its source. As soon as the six senses merge, the gate is entered. Wherever one enters, one sees the head of the bull. This unity is like salt in water, like color in dye stuff. The slightest thing is not apart from self. Okay, so now turning to the text, the commentary, page 72 in the PDF. As we said, we're going to be establishing the view of emptiness. That's the subject to be explained. And we're going to do this in two stages. The first stage is the view of emptiness to be realized by all vehicles of Buddhism. And that's going to be verse 8 to verse 178. And the second is the view of emptiness to be realized exclusively in the Mahayana, which is the rest of chapter 6 from verse 179 to 226. So for the first one, the view to be realized by all vehicles. Now, when we're practicing, the way we do it is we first tackle the clinging to the self of the person, and then later clinging to the self of phenomena. As we saw, first we deal with our denzin, right? The true attachment to self of the person, which causes samsara. And then on the bhumis, we purify our tenzin. But in this text, in the Madhyamaka Avatara, what we're going to do is first, we'll do the other way around, right? First, we're going to refute clinging to the self of phenomena. So that's up to verse 119, and that's going to take us this week and next week. Then we'll do the clinging to the self of the person, which is 120 to 178, and that's in week 5. And one important note that Rinpoche made is, when we talk about emptiness to be realized by all vehicles, we got to be careful because we are going to be refuting a lot of opponents from Buddhist schools, and we don't want to start looking down upon other Buddhists, right? So the emphasis here is that all of the Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, the Theravada, the Mahayana path, they're all practicing emptiness, right? They're all practicing to realize the anatta, right, the non-self, as taught by the Buddha. Or as Rinpoche said, they're all looking at the same emptiness, although perhaps one might say some are closer and see more clearly, and some are further away, a little bit like seeing the other shore that we discussed last week. Although in particular, the Mahayana considers the state of nirvana, the Shravaka Arhat state, as being some kind of island enlightenment, right? And so if that is where you are, if you're following the Shravakayana path, you will nevertheless need to continue on the Bodhisattvayana path to take you to Buddhahood. And actually, for those of you who read the pre-reading from Walpola Rahula, even though he's writing from a more Theravada perspective, he points out that even the Theravada accepts that the Bodhisattva is the highest ideal, and the attainment of the Buddha is greater than the attainment of the Shravaka Arhat or the Pratyeka Buddha. So from the purposes of the actual practitioners on the path, we all have the same aspiration, we're all aiming at the same goal. So what then is the difference here? Well, there's actually a lot of different philosophical schools in ancient India, and then of course in Tibet, many of which, certainly the old Indian Theravada schools, no longer exist. And they all emerged because of a need to explain what does this non-self, this anatta, actually mean in practice. Because in particular, as we saw last week, there are a number of paradoxes that seem not to make sense. For example, how can we talk about karma? how can we talk about doing something today and having some kind of consequence tomorrow if there is no self, right? How might we understand that? So in Buddhism, there were four main schools. We'll look at them today: the Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika, the Chittamatra, and the Madhyamika. And all of them have ground, path, and fruit. And in particular, the other schools, they would say, the Madhyamika is a nisvabhava, that's a nothingness sayer, right? Which in contemporary philosophy we might say is nihilist. And we'll need to defend ourselves against that accusation and explain why that's not the case. And also when we talk about the view being common to all vehicles, just to emphasize, this is actually the first aspect of the Eightfold Path, right? Sammaditha, or right understanding, which we call right view here. And here from Walpola Rahula's book, What the Buddha Taught, in chapter 5, which is about the path, he says, right understanding is the understanding of things as they are, and it is the Four Noble Truths that explain things as they really are. So right understanding, therefore, is ultimately reduced to the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. This understanding is the highest wisdom, which sees the ultimate reality. According to Buddhism, there are two sorts of understanding. What we generally call understanding is knowledge, an accumulated memory, an intellectual grasping of a subject according to certain given data. This is called knowing accordingly, anubbodha. It's not very deep. Real deep understanding is called penetration, pativeda, which is seeing a thing in its true nature, without name or label. This penetration is possible only when the mind is free from all impurities and is fully developed through meditation. Okay, so you can see even there, classic Theravada explanation, this idea of going beyond name, going beyond label, going beyond all kinds of impurities. And likewise, in the mindfulness teachings, right? Very popular in the modern world, and indeed when it's taught even today in the West, mindfulness teachers always refer to the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundation of mindfulness. And in this sutta, it refers to four foundations of mindfulness. Right? The first is, well, actually the four are body, feelings, mind, and mental objects. So the first, the mindfulness of body, or kaya, that leads to exercises like the classic mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of walking, which are taught all the time now in the West, but also meditations on repulsiveness, things like the 9 symmetry meditations, which are not taught so much in the West. The second, mindfulness of feelings and sensations, vedana. So here, this refers to pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations, bare affect, right? It's not really what we would call emotions. This idea of, he hurt my feelings, that's part of the self-narrative, right? That's not part of sensations. The third is mind, or citta. But most interesting is the fourth, right, which is mental objects or phenomena, which can also include teachings or truth. There's other meanings of the word Dhamma, right? So mindfulness of Dhammas. And if you look at the Satipatthana Sutta, that includes things like the 5 hindrances, the aggregates, the sense bases, the factors of enlightenment, and again, the Four Noble Truths. So it's very interesting because in contemporary mindfulness, actually that's largely developed out of the Burmese Theravada tradition, very simplified version of the Sravakayana path, which really only focuses on the first 3 forms of mindfulness. It doesn't actually really teach the fourth, so it has no view as such. So ironically, even though it's called Vipassana, the true Vipassana would be the study of Madhyamika, which is very much not present in contemporary mindfulness. And Rinpoche has talked about this a lot, right? He talks about the kind of mindfulness that's turned into relaxation, mindfulness in 5-star resorts, which is really not what it intended on the Buddhist practice of mindfulness at all. Okay, so bottom on page 73, as we mentioned, we're going to be proceeding through refuting birth or arising. And now from the Dashabhumika Sutra, here there are 10 equalities or 10 ways in which phenomena are equal. I should just say, just for reference, the Dashabhumika Sutra is actually chapter 26 of the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Ornament Sutra or the Flower Garland Sutra, which is one of the most influential Mahayana sutras of East Asian Buddhism. And academics are not entirely sure, but the leading theory is that this is a composed of a number of originally independent scriptures of diverse provenance, which were then combined, probably in Central Asia, sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century. We know the Dashabhumika Sutra was first translated into Chinese in the 3rd century, and the first complete Chinese version of the whole text was around 420. And I know we've talked a lot about how the Madhyamaka, this text, is a commentary on Nagarjuna, his Mula Madhyamaka Karika, but it's also a commentary on the Dashabhumika Sutra, right, the 10 Bhumi Sutra. And a lot of the descriptions of the 10 Bhumis are taken, almost quoted directly from this other sutra. As indeed are the 10 equalities on the bottom of page 73. If you look at the Thomas Cleary translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra, you'll see it's almost exactly the same on page 744. So out of these 10, we're just going to focus on one, which is the absence of birth. And we know this because it was stated by Nagarjuna, verse 1, chapter 1 in his Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, not from itself, not from another, not from both, nor without cause, never in any way is there any existing thing that has arisen. So why are we focusing so much on arising and birth? Well, obviously conventionally, because we see birth and origin stories as a validation of something's provenance, its validity, organic vegetables, made with genuine Italian leather, things like that. But ultimately, a phenomenon is defined as something that has birth, remaining, and cessation. Now, if you think about it, something that doesn't have birth, it's hard really to say that it's a phenomenon. I don't know what we'd describe it exactly, but not a phenomenon. So when we talk about the idea of a truly existing phenomenon, right, remember that's what we're trying to refute here, notions that there might be a truly existing self. What we're really saying is that would imply something that has clear characteristics, clear boundaries that we can point to. Just an example. So let's imagine we were saying, does a person count as a phenomenon? And I might say, well, I know if someone's sitting in the chair across from me or not, right? They're either really there or they're really not there. Surely that would count then as true existence, right? Either they're there or they're not, right? What's the doubt? Well, it might seem obvious, but actually if you ask about origins, then it starts to become a little less obvious. If you think about, debates on abortion, how long after an egg has been fertilized does it count as a person? And there's really no clear cutoff, right? Except for conception itself. But then at the point of conception, all you really have is a fertilized egg. Nobody would say that's a fully functioning person yet, right? And likewise, as a person ages, particularly if they get degenerative diseases, Alzheimer's or other kind of brain damage, we would say that, they're no longer the same person. Right? Likewise, our self of today, is that the same person when we were 5 years old? Right? Most of us would say, well, probably not. Maybe it's not an entirely different person, but once we start to reflect on what it is to be a person, we immediately see, well, we can't really point to something that's sort of unchanging, because actually pretty much everything is changing all the time. Right? Yes, we can trace a continuum from what we call a fertilized egg to what we call a adult human, but they're not the same things. And by the way, when I say what we call a fertilized egg or adult human, notice that even those things are just conventions, right? The notion of adult is totally arbitrary. When do we grant people the age to drink, vote, get married is different in different countries. So, I mean, I live here in Vancouver. We often get American teenagers crossing the border, especially in the summertime, because in Vancouver you can drink when you're 19, but right across the border you can't drink till you're 21. So completely arbitrary, right? So how do we can't say there is a truly existing definition of what it is to be adult. But even though we might begin to understand this intellectually, that doesn't mean we've internalized that knowledge. As we say so many times, just because we have a view doesn't mean it's our theory in use. Right? We might know that our hands are going to age and our skin will become less supple and radiant as we grow older, but that's done nothing, as Roche says, to dent the profits of the huge industry that sells our skin cream in an attempt to preserve our youth and our beauty. And on that point, I would say, look, I mean, for most of us, this idea of truly existing self is not an espoused theory. We never fully established it, right? It's just another assumption. Okay, so I want to spend a little more time actually just again preparing for what we're going to work on this week in terms of the verses. The verses are not actually that difficult as long as we have the right foundation. So I'm going to spend perhaps a little longer on the foundation because I think it's going to help us a lot when we get to the verses themselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about view and stories. Now, stories may not be the language that the text uses, but I think it might help us understand things. Because in particular, a lot of a view is based on a story or an explanation of causality, right? How did things come to be? How do things work in the world? And if you think about a lot of myths or legends or religions, they're based on origin stories. Where does the teacher or the god or the savior come from? What's the origin of his teachings or commands? Why should we accept them and believe them and follow them? Even as we said in the ordinary world, the birth or origin story is a validation, like organic vegetables. And yet, as we've also seen, we may have these explanations of causality, but they are arbitrary, sometimes self, sometimes from other, and they're very much a partial description. So yes, I painted this picture, I got promoted because I worked hard. Yeah, self-arising stories. My boss gave me tough feedback, my bank pays me interest. Those are stories from other arising, right? So we explain the way the world works with these stories. They're very arbitrary, they're not systematic, they're not really any particular theory, they're just ad hoc. And yes, we have them backwards looking to explain the past, but we also rely on stories and views forwards looking, right? As we think about our purpose and things that we're going to do to guide our action. So for example, we might say, I'm working hard, I want to be rich because money makes you happy. You might believe that. And if you believe that story, that will guide your action. You might say, I eat vegetables in order to be healthy. You might even say, I practice the Dharma in order to lead to enlightenment. So notice all of these stories, they always have some kind of because or some kind of in order to. Right? And they're often an answer to a why question, as in, well, why are you doing this? Why did you do this? Why are things the way they are? And stories, they're not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just the reality of in the conventional world, we explain using stories. And one other thing I think is really important to understand, especially as we start to consider the ultimate truth and whatever an ultimate story and explanation might be, all of our stories are partial or incomplete. Right, so if I hold up this piece of paper and I say to you, where does this piece of paper come from? You might say, well, it comes from an office supply store. Or you might say, well, it comes from a tree. Now, I mean, both of these perhaps are true, although these two stories, they're very different and they would lead you in very different directions depending on which part of the story you focused on. So if you followed the first, you might decide you want to become a businessman who sells office supplies. That might be your way of being a bodhisattva to help sentient beings. But perhaps if you like the second story, you might become an ecologist, right? Maybe you want to understand and fight tree diseases. But even this is also incomplete. Right, and in Buddhism, I mean, one of the things we're going to end up concluding in this chapter 6 is that the only way we can really explain causality is through interdependence or dependent arising. There's a lovely story to illustrate this from the Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, also on the topic of where does a piece of paper come from. Let me read it to you. He says, if you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Because without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. If we look into this sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. So we know the sunshine is also in this sheet of paper. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we see that without all of these things, this sheet of paper cannot exist. Right, so hopefully now the problem is becoming a little clearer, right? We can't tell even a simple story like where does this paper come from? We can't tell it completely. It's going to take us too long, right? We simply cannot cover off all the different causes, conditions, and aspects of the story. So it's inevitable we have to simplify our stories. That's what we do all the time, right? And we just have to hope that nothing important is going to be left out. Actually, if you think, for example, about the environmental movement, it turns out that we've now learned that a lot of things were left out of our economic production processes, right? Economists call these things externalities, but it turns out if you pollute, if you have toxic emissions, these come with real consequences, right? So now we realize we can't leave them out after all, right? So our story of what it is to have sustainable production, what it is to have a good economy, has become more inclusive, but also more complicated. So one other thing I think is also interesting is when you think about the stories of your own life, what counts as a good explanation? What should you leave in? What should you leave out? And I think notions of personal accountability are very important here. There's a lovely example from Fred Kaufman, who used to be a professor of economics at the MIT Sloan School. He says, if you're holding an apple and you drop it to the floor, you might ask, what caused this? And yes, of course, we all know what causes an apple to fall. Well, it's gravity. Yeah, Newton's famous story of the apple falling on his head. But actually, if you think about it, there's another cause here as well. The other cause was we were holding the apple and now we let it go. And so if you think about it, well, which one of these two do we have any choice over? Right? We don't really have a choice when it comes to gravity, but we do have a choice about whether or not we let the apple go. So in this way, I think Buddhism also focuses on karma, personal accountability, right? Really looking at the part of the story that we can do something about. So more on stories, right? I mean, our stories, they are like maps of the world, right? They encode knowledge. They allow us to navigate the world. Now, many or most animals survive on instincts, but we know actually many animals, and then we have an ever-growing number of examples, they also build sophisticated models of the world. We know chimpanzees can recognize themselves in the mirror. We know that scrub jays, they're going to sneak back and re-hide the food if another bird was watching them hide it the first time. Unless, of course, that watcher was their mate. We know that rats, when they're doing experiments where they push levers to get rewards, if they push the wrong lever and they fail to get a reward, they'll gaze regretfully at the lever they should have pushed. And likewise for us, right? It's useful to learn that lions are dangerous. It's useful to know which mushrooms are edible and which ones are poisonous. And much of what we think of as experience and knowledge is about building this good map of the world, right? So we want good stories in the relative truth. But then we also have, problematic stories. It's not like all our stories are good, right? For example, I mean, there was a time when many cultures were very concerned about eclipses, especially solar eclipses, because they thought that demons or animals consumed the sun. And they had all kinds of ceremonies or songs or dances, and sometimes even sacrifices, sometimes even human sacrifices, to placate these demons from destroying the world. Now, of course, we have a better story, a better map, right? We know from science how eclipses work, which is good, right? We don't sacrifice as many people in the name of preventing the demons from eating the sun. But, throughout human history, we've had all kinds of dangerous and wrong views, right? Things that we've believed that have been dangerous either to ourselves or to others. Some examples might be, burning witches in the Middle Ages. I mean, estimates of something like 50 to 200,000 women were tortured and burned and killed, right? No evidence except that people thought they were witches. Or perhaps human sacrifice in the Aztec or Mayan cultures in Mesoamerica. Or throughout the modern world at that time, you had trepanning, right? Drilling a hole in the head supposedly to let out evil spirits. And the fact that so many people died once you drilled a hole in the head, well, that just served to show that, yes, the evil spirit had really done its damage. So I think we can see now, with the benefit of a little scientific hindsight, that these stories weren't very helpful. But at a more mundane level, most of us also have stories that are distorted or inaccurate or incomplete, which lead us to see the world inaccurately or to behaviors that are ineffective, unhelpful, which lead to bad outcomes or to suffering. And in particular, in the Madhyamaka, our stories that lead us in bad directions are stories about the self, right? That's what we're going to do. So, as we said, ultimately, we don't want any stories, and relatively, we're just going to follow the conventional stories of the everyday world. And again, if we're concerned about nihilism, we're not eliminating reality, right? We're not destroying reality. All we're doing is we're eliminating our stories that refer to any truly existing self in the personal phenomena, because those are the stories that make us suffer. Right? Buddhism is never nihilistic. And Rinpoche said on this point, he said, often we think of this teaching or this text as a text on the ultimate truth, which in many ways it is, but actually it's mostly about stories and theories about arising, right? It's really about relative truth. Just one other thought about the difference between irrational and rational stories. And Rinpoche already touched on this. We'll often teach on how we journey from irrationality to rationality to beyond rational. And there's a lovely interview with the philosopher A.C. Grayling. I just want to touch on this, where he talks about rationality and belief. He says, not only is there no good evidence for the existence of supernatural agency, gods and goddesses and demons and so on, but there's a very great deal of evidence suggesting this universe is not the kind of place that has those sorts of things in it. Very often people will say you can't prove there aren't gods and goddesses, and I say you can if you understand the nature of proof in the contingent case. Of course, in the formal case of mathematics and logic, proof is something completely coercive. The conclusion is entailed by the premises. But in the contingent case, what we mean by proof is test. We prove a bar of steel by bending it until it snaps. That's the test of it. This is where we get expressions like the proof of the pudding. Proof is the contingent empirical sense about the world around us. It's a matter of testing it. And this argument's beautifully done by Carl Sagan, a famous astronomer, when he talks about the dragon in the garage. So if somebody says, I've got a dragon in my garage, and you say, well, I'd love to see it. Ah, says the other person, it's invisible. And you say, well, let's sprinkle some powder on the floor and see if we can see its footprints. Ah, it never lands on the floor. Well, maybe then we can hear its wings fluttering. Ah, it's got silent wings, and so on and so on. Nothing whatever will count as a test, one way or another, for the claim that there is a dragon in the garage. And that simple, straightforward, but very deep observation applies to all claims to the effect that there are supernatural agencies or entities in this universe of ours. And for that reason, it's not rational. By rational, we say, ratio, it has this idea of proportion. We're proportioning evidence to judgments, right? So it's not rational to think there are fairies at the bottom of the garden, gods on Olympus, or Poseidon under the sea. So part of what we will be doing is using rationality in our logic and our arguments. But as we saw with Thich Nhat Hanh, part of our challenge is a complete rational explanation is also impossible. And as we go towards non-duality, as subject and object are transcended and begin to break down, then even rationality will break down. So page 76, I'm sure just there's an extended section here which I'm not going to go through in detail on the difference between the Prasangika and the Svatantrika Madhyamika. And really, these are two schools which were, although they were both present in India, they didn't really have those names until the Tibetans later gave them those names. And it really comes down to how they establish the view of ultimate truth and how they approach conventional truth. And essentially, the Prasangika Madhyamika, and that's Chandrakirti, they would argue we don't need logic, we don't need positions of our own, we don't need our own views. All we need to do is show that all other views collapse when they're investigated. But the Svatantrika Madhyamika, they wish to establish a theory in the relative truth, right? Because they don't just think it's enough to deconstruct the opponent. And there's a very good book I'd recommend to you if you really want to understand more. It's called Moon Shadows by a collective of contemporary Madhyamika scholars that call themselves the Cowherds. And chapter 1 just talks a little bit about Chandrakirti's view. So this is Guy Newland and Tom Tillemans. They say, one way to look at the Prasangika Svatantrika debate within Indo-Tibetan Madhyamika is in terms of allegiance to or rejection of the unschooled world's opinions on conventional matters. Some Prasangikas, who style themselves as Madhyamikas who accept as conventionally true just what the world acknowledges to be true, they seem to advocate a kind of extremely pure conventionalism in which a Buddhist should just read off the surface and acquiesce in the world's opinions and epistemic practices as they are. But the Svatantrikas, like the 8th century Indian thinker Kamalashila, strongly argue against this deliberate adoption of the world stance. Their argument is essentially that when the truth loses normative force and collapses into simply what is widely accepted, then criticism and growth of knowledge becomes impossible. So it's a very powerful argument, and indeed there's a lot of debate, theories of knowledge, Buddhist epistemology, which go into that in a lot of detail. We're not going to do that here, but I encourage you to read that if you're interested in learning more. So, page 80. So we've established that we have a view, or that we have these 4 statements, that things don't arise from self, other, both, or neither. But a classic counter-argument for our opponent, it says, look, well, if you, Chandrakirti, say you have no view, what on earth are you teaching for, right? Why are you writing these extensive texts? I mean, that sounds an awful lot like you have some kind of view if you're writing all this stuff. And indeed, I mean, what about the Buddha's teachings? I mean, the Four Noble Truths. I mean, you say you have no view, but how can you accept that? That sounds an awful lot like a view as well. So here, the Prasangika has 2 answers. First, Chandrakirti will say, look, I mean, I accept these things, but only as conventional teachings, right? I'm not saying they're ultimately true. I'm accepting them just as a path, just as a means of communication, as something illusory, something paradoxical, something untrue, but that will lead you to the truth. And secondly, I'm doing it because I have compassion, right? I want to lead all sentient beings to enlightenment, and I can't do that unless I communicate with them in some way. Rinpoche quoted His Holiness Dalai Lama always teaches this verse of homage before he teaches, even before he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. He says, "To the Lord Buddha, who taught us the viewless teaching in order to destroy all views, I prostrate." And so as you've seen before, yes, we have no view. That is our view. And Chandrakirti, yes, he accepts the Buddha's teaching, but just like a raft, right, as we saw last week, it's for crossing over, not for holding on to. It's not the ultimate truth. It's not the ultimate goal. And I was thinking it's actually very similar to the role of medicine in treating disease, right? If you look at the dictionary definition, it's interesting. Health also has this drel-dre, right, this result of absence. And the definition is, health is the state of being free from illness or injury. Synonyms: well-being, healthiness, fitness, good condition. So, just like the Dharma path, to become healthy, we get rid of our illness. So, for example, we might take antibiotics if we need to get rid of a certain kind of disease. But once we've got rid of the disease, you don't want to keep taking antibiotics, right? Just like you don't want to take the boat with you once you've reached the other shore. Because if you keep taking antibiotics, right, as we know, overprescription of antibiotics has led to this crisis in modern medicine, where there are now all these superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics. So, similar idea, right? So yes, we have the path, we have these views, but they're purely conventional. They're purely as a means to lead sentient beings to the other shore, but it's not like we're attached to these views. Right, one other thing that's very important, we touched on it last week already, but it's this difference between view language and path language. Right, so in terms of view language, we say we have no views. Indeed, there's nowhere to go. But in path language, we're not at our destination yet, right? So we need the right view. We talk about right view and wrong view. We talk about right direction and wrong direction. Because although ultimately we want to get beyond all views, we want to get to action that's not limited or driven by dualistic narratives, we're not there yet, right? So in the meantime, we need relative views, right? Especially a view of the path. Now, the thing with path language, unlike view language, which we're studying here, very precise, we talk about refutations, we establish the lack of true existence. Path language can be incredibly varied, right? And there's some classic stories of like Naropa and Tilopa, where the master can hit the student with a shoe and give him a moment of insight. Or the classic story of Patrarumsha and Yoshi Longtok, right? Where saying, look at the stars in the sky, and just that invitation to look, that moment, shifted completely the worldview. So Rinpoche gave an example of sunglasses, right? So yes, it's a great example. If we're wearing colored sunglasses, if we put on a pair of orange sunglasses, the world looks orange. Now we know that's not real, and we also know to see the true colors, we can take off our sunglasses, right? So in this case, the truth, again, it's a result of elimination. And in some cases, it can be perhaps as instantaneous as removing sunglasses. But more typically, again, as we saw last week, we have a gradual path, which then will, after accumulation of practice, lead to sudden results. So I'll give an example. Right, perhaps your child is unhappy. Perhaps he's gone to a new school and he says, everyone hates me. I don't like my school. And then, well, let's suppose you say first, well, that's not true. They don't really hate you. And maybe just that is enough where your child will sort of calm down and say, well, I suppose that's true. More likely, though, they may not be that satisfied with that, so you're probably going to have to engage in more of a path, right? You might say, well, didn't you say you like your friend Adam? Doesn't he going to spend time with you and help you with your homework? You say, oh, I guess so. And then what about your friend Stephen? I know you like to go and kick the football around together. And so slowly but surely, you teach a gradual path and you get rid of the wrong view, right? In this case, the view that everyone hates me, which is causing your child suffering. You get closer to the truth. But, it may be that even after you've given all these different examples, maybe nothing works, right? So what counts as a good path teaching, as opposed to view teaching, is really what can we hear, what can we absorb at any given time, which is why it is said the Buddha taught 84,000 different teachings. And we saw last week already, to whom should the middle way be taught? And we saw there were different kinds of audience. And, the ideal audience for the Madhyamaka is somebody, whose eyes well up with tears, whose hairs on their skin stand up on edge when they hear these teachings. Rinpoche, classically, he gave a lovely example. He talked about 3 different kinds of students. And he said, there's one kind of student. You'll give them a teaching, they'll hear it once, and immediately they'll act on it. He said there's a second kind of student. You'll give them the teaching, but they won't do anything. And you'll repeat the teaching over and over, perhaps over many, many years. And then finally, at some point, they'll finally hear you, and they'll actually take some action. And he said then there's a third kind of student. You can teach them again and again till you're blue in the face, and nothing's going to shift. They're just never going to get it until they have some sort of life experience, right? Some sort of crisis, some sort of catalytical event that wakes them up. And maybe at that point they can hear it. So again, the encouragement for us is how do we engage in our practice so that we become that first kind of student? I was reading a lovely interview of the American hip-hop artist and producer J. Cole on NPR in 2014. It's a great interview, just actually on sufferings of samsara, wrong views, freedom, liberation. I mean, it's not a Buddhist interview per se, but it's very Buddhist in its outlook. But in particular, there's a lovely section which sounds just like what I just explained in terms of Rinpoche's perspective on these three views. So the interviewer, Franny Kelly, says to him, so you were talking about evolving and sort of figuring it out. Do you think you can just tell people that and they'll just believe you and like change what they're doing? Or do you think that everyone has to figure it out on their own? And J. Cole says, well, you can leave breadcrumbs for kids or for whoever at whatever point in their life. So I could explain it to someone right now. Well, let's say there are 3 people. One, I can tell them my story and what I understood about life. And this person might hear that and be like, oh my God, that hits me perfectly right now at this point in my life. That's what I needed because I'm going through this and I wasn't sure. And this gives me perfect clarity. I was putting importance on the wrong things. And that person gets it. The second person might hear it and like it. Not totally understand, but like it. But it still doesn't change their life. Not right then. But you give them a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. They'll come back and they'll hear it differently. With new life experiences, they'll come back and be like, oh my God, that's what he meant. And then it'll change them. Later. It'll help them change then. And then you have the third kind of person who might never get it. They might not ever get the life experience for that talk to ever get through to them. You know what I'm saying? I realized that listening back to Park, who I always loved, but the more I live my life, the more I understand more what he was saying. Every year I go back to Park, and I mean, I'm on him more every year, but every new year of my life, I have a new level of understanding. So, here J. Cole was talking about the rapper Tupac, but this could just as easily be us describing our relationship to our understanding and our realization of the Madhyamaka, right, the Buddha's teachings. I just one other example of view and path language. It's a lovely, another Zen story called Nothing Exists. So Yamaoka Teshu, as a young student of Zen, visited one master after another. He called upon Dokuon of Shokoku. Desiring to show his attainment, he said, The mind, Buddha, and sentient beings, after all, do not exist. The true nature of phenomena is emptiness. There is no realization, no delusion, no sage, no mediocrity. There is no giving and nothing to be received. Dokuan, who was smoking quietly, said nothing. Then suddenly he whacked Yamaoka with his bamboo pipe. This made the youth quite angry. If nothing exists, inquired Dokuan, where did this anger come from? So I love that story. And again, just an invitation. Make sure we actually practice and don't get too caught up in how well we think we know the view. All right, so 82. What is to be established? In the ultimate truth that all phenomena are free from extremes, and in this case extremes include the extremes of existence, non-existence, both and neither, and in relative truth that all appearances are like illusion. And for both, we need to negate clinging to all appearances as truly existent. Right, and notice here about how view and path mutually reinforce. So, again now page 83, we're talking about refuting wrong views on the part of others. How are we going to establish this view, this phenomena being free from extremes, this appearances being like illusion? Well, the path is going to purify delusory appearances, so delusions like anger are refuted by love and compassion, things like that. But here, we're going to refute these wrong stories or views by the Buddha's words and logic. And actually, we're not going to use the word defilements, as Rinpoche said, because that's path language. So here you'll notice the text uses very precise, almost surgical language, right, view language. We say what we're going to do here is we're going to refute the labeling created by imputation and innate ignorance. Right, so just again, imputation, that's concepts, right, conceptual ignorance. That's explicit or implicit views and beliefs. Whereas the innate, that's labeling. We can also have labeling that is from or after innate ignorance, implicit notions of I. The Sanskrit is innate is sahaja, or co-emergent ignorance, which is defined as the ignorance that's co-emergent with our innate nature and remains present even as the potential for confusion to arise when meeting with the right conditions. Whereas imputed, parakalpita, that's invented or contrived or settled. And I quite like, there's a nice definition from Tulku Ugyen Rinpoche in his book Vajra Speech, where he says, there are two types of ignorance, co-emergent and conceptual ignorance. In the moment after seeing our essence, it almost immediately slips away. We get distracted and we start to think of something. Co-emergent ignorance is simply to forget. Conceptual ignorance comes in the moment after forgetting, forming thought after thought. As one thought follows after another, a long train of thoughts can develop. Forgetting and thinking, this is the twofold ignorance, co-emergent ignorance and conceptual ignorance. If these two were purified, we would be Buddhas. But as long as the co-emergent and conceptual aspects of ignorance are not purified, we are sentient beings. Okay, so how then are we going to do this refutation? Page 85 now. In the Prasangika, we use the four methods of pointing out contradictions, using inferential logic of our opponents, reductio ad absurdum, and circularity, right? So basically, we don't use any of our own arguments, our own statements. We just show our opponent's views fall apart. And as we are now going to get into our first opponent, we need to just talk a little about what do we mean by true existence. So I think this is where a lot of the confusion stems. As we saw earlier, right, a lot of the time we'll talk about things in the relative world. We'll say things are there. We'll say, yes, I have a, I'm here, you're over there. We'll talk about phenomena in the world as if they're real, as if they're true. but we're not doing it analytically, right? This isn't a philosophical position. Because for a phenomenon to be truly existing, you'd need to be able to sort of define and demarcate its boundaries, right? Like we saw earlier with the example of the embryo and the baby, right? Conventionally, we'd say an embryo and a baby are two different things, right? So if we had such a thing as a truly existing human or a truly existing baby, we'd need to be able to draw some kind of boundary around it. In other words, it must be unchanging, right? We can't have these boundaries shifting all the time. Otherwise, it's not a fixed, identifiable ultimate thing. And once we know it's unchanging, or has to be unchanging, it must also be independent, right? Because as we also know, as soon as something is dependent on other causes and conditions, it will be changeable, it will be impermanent. Right? So we'll often use the words independent and unchanging to talk about the absolute or the ultimate truth. So, I like to think about it almost like the old atomic model of matter, right? A kind of billiard ball. This idea that there are these solid billiard balls which are independent and unchanging, and those are sort of the elements that we're talking about. We'll come back to that, because actually a couple of the Buddhist schools have a view very much like that. Just back to the dictionary. We sometimes use absolute truth, sometimes ultimate truth. Ultimate means being or happening at the end of a process, final, or synonyms are eventual, final, concluding, terminal. I think actually absolute is closer to the meaning. Absolute is viewed or existing independently and not in relation to other things, not relative or comparative. Synonyms are universal, fixed, independent, non-relative, non-variable, absolutist. And, for our path, we obviously want to base our path on something that we can trust, right? I mean, any path, there needs to be a foundation, something we take refuge in. And if this source of refuge is changeable, it means we can't trust it, right? If today our path's telling us to take the left-hand path and tomorrow the right-hand path, it's not reliable, right? It's not consistent. We can't follow a path that's changeable. Right, so if you think of the navigators of old, they would use the pole star in the sky, right, Polaris, because it's a fixed star. So similarly, what is it that we're going to use to guide our ethics, to guide our practice? What is the foundation? And when it's variable, another example might be, someone trying to lose weight, a couple decades ago, all the guidance was fat is bad, so people gave up fat. Now we know it's not fat that's bad, it's carbs that are bad, right? So now the focus is on low-carb diets. But again, the view changed, so the practice changed. I think the other important thing is, religions, they will say we need to pay homage or to pray to the ultimate cause, usually some kind of God, because the object of refuge is the object of prayer. Because if God creates the universe and God is responsible for all things, it's rational. It makes sense to pray to God because He's the source. He's the only one who can actually change your circumstances, right? So if you believe that God is the truly existing source, all things arise from God, then your rational path would be to pray to God, right? So it does actually matter that we have the right true existence because that determines our path, right? So, turning to the verses, that's actually taken us, all the preliminaries now are done. Verse 6, first two lines, page 89. This is Nagarjuna's famous four statements that set out the view. Not created by itself, how can it be created by another? Not created by both, what exists without a cause? Now I know here in the commentary, Rinpoche called these four affirmations. That's actually, I would say he's misspoken here because they're not actually affirmations. We'll come back to that in a bit. If you're interested, I strongly recommend another part of the background reading, which was there was a piece I offered from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on negation, just making the point that just because you're negating something does not mean you are affirming its opposite, right? Um, so what we're going to do now is negate the four different forms of arising, which are from self, other, both, and neither. And traditionally, at the time of Chandrakirti, these were related to four classical schools of Indian philosophy. So arising from self was the Samkhya. It's a Hindu school, strongly dualistic, where on one side there's consciousness, on the other side there's mind and matter. Arising from others was the lower Buddhist schools, but also the Chittamatra. Arising from both is Jainism, which has arising from both self or soul and matter. And interestingly, both the soul, the jiva, and matter, the pudgala, are both considered active ontological substances, while the other components are inactive. So it's an unusual theory where there is indeed arising from both self and other. And finally, arising from neither is the Charvakas, who are non-Hindu atheist materialists. Now, there's a brief introduction to the Samkhya here. The background reading had a lot more detail. If you really want to get into it, I'd encourage you to read that. In the Western philosophical traditions, we equate mind with consciousness, and we see that separate from matter. But actually, the Samkhya viewpoint's a little different. The line there is between consciousness and matter for them includes mind. So they see two irreducible, innate, independent realities they call Purusha and Prakriti. So Prakriti is matter, body and mind, and Purusha is the consciousness, and there can be multiple Purushas in the world. And Prakriti is unintelligent, unmanifest, uncaused, and yet ever active. Whereas the Purusha is the conscious principle, but it doesn't interact with the Prakriti, right? It's a very strong dualism. So it is a passive enjoyer, right? It's called bhokta, when Prakriti is the enjoyed, bhogya. So it's interesting, in terms of the arising, the consciousness, the Purusha, is not regarded as the source of anything in the inanimate world. Which I find this view quite interesting. I mean, I know it seems ancient Hinduism, but if you think about contemporary philosophy of consciousness, we have this question of how does the material, physical mind and brain give rise to consciousness, right? And there's a lot of people who argue, well, matter cannot give rise to consciousness, which is something the Samkhya would agree with, right? So, we might, if we're contemporary philosophers who argue that we need something separate because you can't explain consciousness materialistically, what then would we say for the opposite direction? I mean, how can consciousness influence the world, the material world, if the world can't influence consciousness? That's very relevant to Buddhist explanations of karma and rebirth. So we'll come back to that, but I strongly invite you maybe start to read ahead, because it's already put up some references for week 5. How might we understand this? And so in the Samkhya, the causality, the model there is that the causes are all already in the Prakriti. So if the example is the potter who makes the clay pot, well, you could argue the pot is already in the clay. Right, the Sankhya call this the Sat Karyavada, or the existent effect theory. Right, Rinpoche says, all you need to really know is that the cause already contains the result. Right. Actually, it's interesting if you look again at the background reading. Their path, therefore, because we know the Purusha and Prakriti are independent of one another, the escape from the endless circle of samsara is only possible through realizing the fundamental difference between this nature, the Prakriti, and persons, the Purusha, whereby an individual Purusha loses interest in the nature and Prakriti and is thereby liberated. Which again is fascinating, right? Because if you think about why then did the ancient Hindu schools renounce samsara? Why then did they practice transcendental meditation? It's still active today. If people who practice TM, it's really abandoning the world. And again, if you hold to the Samkhya philosophy, that makes sense, right? Because if you can't influence the world, if your consciousness is just an observer, then it makes no sense to stay engaged in the world of samsara. So, similarly in Christianity, if God created the world and is all-powerful, the only path that makes sense is to submit to him and his will, to pray and so on and so forth. One might equally say, if we believe money is the root of happiness, we'll make money. If we believe money is the root of all evil, we'll become renunciant monks. Now, you might think this Samkhya view seems a little outrageous, but as Rinpoche said, it's very important because a lot of us, we might think we're more sophisticated than this, but actually our understanding of Buddha nature might well be a lot like this, right? A lot of us think, especially if we study the Uttara Tantra, we already have Buddha nature within us, and all we're doing is removing the defilements, right? Sounds an awful lot like saying the result is already present even now. And a lot of the, third turning teachings use language like that. If we don't understand it, we could very easily get confused, right? We could get a view very much like a Samkhya view. Separately, if there's any interested philosophical scientists out there, we say there's no self-arising. What about radioactive decay? Right? There's seemingly no external cause, but from nothing, randomly, a radioactive nuclide emits radiation, alpha particles, beta particles, neutrinos. How do we explain this? We know Einstein famously said, God does not play with dice, but, what then, how do you explain that kind of self-arising? So the verses themselves, actually, they're almost absurdly simple. And perhaps easiest to understand if you just remind yourself, look, well, if we say Prakriti is truly existent, which indeed the Samkhya do, well, they can't be referring to the whole of Prakriti because we know that Prakriti changes, right? And we know that something truly existing can't change. So they must be referring to individual phenomena within Prakriti, right? And as we said, these must be like billiard balls, right? So when we talk about a pot coming from clay, we can't talk about a half pot because there's no, because then it wouldn't be ultimately existing. It would be emerging, right? A bit like, it would be then a process like the embryo to the baby to the adult. But if the pot didn't appear from nowhere, it's already in the clay, you might equally have another example like the seed and the sprout, right? There's no half sprout. The sprout is already there in the seed. And so then you read the verses. I won't read them all, but as it says, there is no purpose in something already arisen, arising again. Right? Or in verse 9, if you truly believe something already created could recreate, production such as germination could not occur. Right? Because the cause would just keep recreating the cause. You just have seed after seed after seed, right? And so on. I think all these examples are actually fairly straightforward. And really, the conclusion then is, well, yes, there may well be a rising in the Samkhya theory, but we cannot hold to the idea that it's true arising, right? There's no truly existing self. It doesn't make sense. It falls apart, which then means we say, okay, we reject the truly existing self-arising, which means, yes, it's just another story. It's not actually something we take refuge in. It's funny, actually, if you read the background article on the Samkhya from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the author there says, this Samkhya analysis of causation opposes the view taken by the Nyaya philosophy. And actually, if you think about the Samkhya view, taken literally, it's not tenable. If the cause existed, why was it not perceived prior to the point called its production? So it's funny, right? Even a contemporary commentator cannot make sense of the Samkhya in the Samkhya's own terms. And the Nyaya, which was another school at the same time, another Hindu school, basically said, they said the opposite. They said an effect does not pre-exist in its cause, right? The cause has to come before the effect. In any case, Rinpoche said, look, the self-born is not really a big problem for most of us. We mostly don't believe in that. It's really more some Vedic religions. For us, it's much more other arising. Right, so this is our Buddhist schools, in fact, all the way up to the Svatantrika Madhyamika's explanation of the relative truth. And so one of the definitions we'll see, well, let's just first take the dictionary definition. Other is something that is different or distinct from one already mentioned or known about. And we'll see that in the Madhyamika, one of the aspects of the definition is that it must be present at the same time. Now, why would that be? Because if it's not present at the same time, there can be no interaction. Right? Back to the billiard balls colliding. Right? If you have a billiard ball yesterday and a billiard ball today, unless they're there at the same time, the same day, you cannot say that they collide. Right? There's no way you can make yesterday's billiard ball hit today's billiard ball. Right? So this problem of causality is central to all these conversations about all these theories of Buddhist schools. In particular, the problem we already mentioned is how to explain causation over time, right? Because if you believe in other arising, you need some kind of connection between the cause, which is in the past, and the result, which might be in the present. So a lot of these other schools talk about this kind of connector. But the verses themselves actually are not too difficult. Because once you accept that things are truly other, right? In other words, they don't have anything in common because they're like two billiard balls that are separate from one another. Then verse 14, if something were created based on something other than itself, you could have deep darkness arising from a flame. Right? I mean, the point here is, why would a flame necessarily come from another flame? Why couldn't darkness come from a flame? They are equally other, right? In the sense there's nothing connecting the two. Our opponent says, well, this is verse 15, he says, yes, but there's a continuum. Rice only gives rice seeds only give rice shoots, not barley. But then here, we say, well, yes, but actually that's just proving nothing, right? It's a circular argument because we just repeated our statement. Page 106, just in parentheses, Rinpoche at this point, we're just talking about the structural outline in the commentaries. For those of you following along in the text, you'll notice at the back of the book there are a number of these structural outlines which structure the text into a sort of tree structure. Now, this was not part of the original text, but added by the commentator. Right now, in this case, the structural outline of the trees at the back of this text were the ones from Gorampa. He was a 15th century Sakya scholar. And Rinpoche says, Mipam's outline is quite similar. So for those of you who have the Padmakara translation, that's using Mipam's structural outline. When Rinpoche continued teaching this the second year in 98, he said he used Rendawa's commentary, another Sakya scholar, this time the 14th century, and he was a teacher of Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa's presentation of the Madhyamaka is actually very different, and we really don't have time to go into that. And for those of you interested in the Khyentse lineage, Rinpoche also said Jomyen Khyentse Wangpo and Jomyen Khyentse Chukyi Lodro, they mainly used the commentaries by the Dzogchen Khenpa Zhenga. Khenpa Zhenga doesn't really have too much Tibetan fabrication. So he was a 19th, 20th century Rime master, actually one of the teachers of Jomyen Khyentse Chukyi Lodro. So just to say, there's a lot of different commentaries one can draw upon. And even in this text, Rinpoche is drawing from several different commentaries. Okay, continuing. So verse 17. Now, we've talked about the necessity for things that are other to be coexisting. But that gives rise to a different set of problems, right? Because if they're both there, how do you differentiate cause and effect? Right? If they're both there, you can't say that the cause caused the effect, because the effect was already there. So you couldn't say the cause is necessary. So our opponent objects and says, well, maybe it's like a pair of scales where one rises as the other falls. And actually, this example comes from the Rice Seedling Sutra. It's a Buddhist sutra, so it's a good Buddhist example. But as Chandrakirti says, look, this is it's a provisional teaching, and in any case, it was used to teach dependent arising, not true arising. And if you have a true cause, then as long as something is arising, it hasn't yet arisen, right? So as long as the baby is still an embryo, the baby hasn't yet arisen. But likewise, when something is ceasing, it still exists, right? So we might say that the tree is growing old and dying, but until the tree has ceased, we still have the tree. Yeah, I think it's also very interesting if you look at contemporary philosophy here, because there's a big challenge with the what's called the arrow of time in science. Now, we know that time is relative. In fact, we even know now that Einstein's theory explains it very precisely, right? Our naive intuitions about simultaneity don't actually hold. So, for example, I mean, we know our GPS is run by satellites, and the time on the Earth is different from the time on a satellite because it's moving quite quickly around the Earth, sufficiently quickly that the theory of relativity applies. And actually, if we didn't correct for these relativistic effects between the time on the satellite and the time on Earth, you'd have a navigational error of 2 kilometers per day, right? So it's really very significant on the Earth. And I find it quite interesting because, you know, it's if you look at the Wikipedia entry on the arrow of time, so this was developed by Arthur Eddington, the British astronomer, in 1927, and it remains an unsolved general physics question because physical processes at the microscopic level are believed to be entirely or mostly time symmetric, right? If the time direction were to reverse, the theories would be true still. And yet we know at the macroscopic level, it's not the case, right? There seems to be an obvious directional flow to time. So what does all of this mean, right? If time itself does not truly exist, and by the way, in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Nagarjuna himself said this, right? He refuted that there is truly existing time. He even refuted truly existing causality, right? So I think, again, continuing, I think the other verse is quite similar. So verse 20, if cause and effect don't coexist, you can't say that cause gives rise to an effect. Makes sense. And 21, we refute it in terms of the fourfold classification, basically saying, if you say an effect comes from a cause, do you say this effect exists or it doesn't exist? Because if you say it doesn't exist, well, then you can't say the cause actually caused anything. But if the effect's already there, then you don't need a cause, right? So, same problem. Now, so that's sort of the expression of the sort of absurdity of the view of truly existent other arising. And you can already start to see, well, yeah, I guess as long as we are thinking in terms of true existence, in terms of true phenomena that are like billiard balls, it doesn't make sense, right? How can this work? But now our opponent says, well, ordinary people, they accept other arising, and you, Chandrakirti, say you're going to follow them. So now we need to introduce the two truths, right, to explain what's going on here. And here, Chandrakirti will refute this in 3 steps. He'll say that he accepts ordinary people's experience, but only as relative truth, right, as a means of communication, not its validity, right, so not as ultimate truth. And therefore, he'll show ordinary people don't contradict Madhyamaka. And in fact, he'll show those who do have problems with ordinary people are our opponents, because they have theories about the relative, which then start to interfere with and contradict what ordinary people say. Rinpoche said in passing, I liked his quote, he said, in 115, he said, whenever there's agreement or disagreement between two people, the two truths are functioning. Right? So anytime we have different ideas of what is real, what is actually the case, right? When we're using different facts and different evidence, we're deriving different conclusions. All of this is the two truths in action. The example again of sunglasses, I guess a good example. So yes, if you're wearing some green sunglasses and you're looking at a white tent or a white wall, you might see it as green, right? It's a mistake. So your perception, your experience, right? That's relative truth, right? Your experience, which for you, you would swear this is what you're genuinely experiencing here and now, but that isn't actually corresponding to the truth, right? But as Rinpoche says, we are wearing sunglasses, not we are the sunglasses, right? So like the drill dray we talked about before, we can remove our obscurations. Right? Our distortion is not permanent. And this is a good example because we're emphasizing the subjectivity of the two truths. There's a lovely quote on page 119, actually one of my favorites from Jamila Rinpoche said, as soon as we talk, it is all contradiction. As soon as we think, it is all confusion. So this is very much the Prasangika view, right? There's no point trying to rely on thoughts or on language because it's all just going to fall apart, right? All our traditional tools of rationality just will not serve us. Right, and as we're discussing also on page 119, he says, look, the thing with relative truth is once you start to analyze it, it will collapse, right? So classic example, you might say, well, my hand, what is my hand made of? What's its true essence? We say, well, it's made of fingers, it's made of skin, it's made of bone, it's made of bloods. But once you start to analyze it, once you've got skin and bones and blood, you don't have the hand anymore, right? It falls apart as a concept, right? And Rinpoche said, look, if when you deconstruct, when you analyze, if at the end of your analysis you find something that's truly existent, then you have a problem, right? Then you have found something ultimate, and then your whole system of relative truth will collapse. And again, just repeating, right? I mean, ordinary people, we don't think that way, right? We don't talk about theories of other arising. Yeah, I mean, you ask the cowherd and say, well, where do the cow's horns come from? Or where does milk come from? And he'll just say, well, it comes from the cow. We don't explain things in terms of a theory. Now, maybe a scientist would say, things come from atoms or molecules. But even then, I mean, we know from philosophy of science that this isn't an ultimate view. So let's talk a little about the two truths. And we'll see actually that for the other schools, part of the challenge is they actually define the two truths objectively, right, based on phenomena out there. And this is a mistake because once you've done that, that means there are actual objects in the world which are true or untrue. Whereas for Chandrakirti, the two truths are differentiated based on the subject, right? So like the example of green sunglasses or no green sunglasses, reality itself doesn't change. It's the way we view it, right? That determines whether or not we see things correctly, whether it's relative truth or not. And Rinpoche made a provocative statement on 121. He said, only in Buddhism is truth differentiated based on the subject. And again, for those of you who want to contemplate a little, interesting question. What about the observer effect in quantum physics, right? Because that's the subject. So the observer actually has, changes the truth that we observe in the world. So that's an interesting example too. Just in terms of translation, I know we use the word relative truth, but Rinpoche doesn't like that word. The Tibetan and Sanskrit, they both have this connotation of obscured or deceptive truth, right? Again, the idea is we are actually, it's not just that it is not ultimate, that it's relative, but it's somehow been interfered with. So let's look at our opponents. if you, I mean, again, it's gone through pretty quickly in the text here. If you really want a much fuller explanation, in the pre-reading, again, there's this really excellent overview by Sonam Thakur in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. If you want the detail, please do read that. But essentially, the four Buddhist schools, the Vaibhashika, they believe the ultimate reality is irreducible spatial units, right, sort of small atoms, and irreducible temporal units, right, point, moments, or instants of consciousness. So there's sort of like an atom of material and an atom of mind. The next school, the Sautrantika, another Theravada school, similar, right? They also have these units, but they say that ultimate truth is a phenomenon that is ultimately existent, and that means ultimately causally efficient, right? So it's all in terms of function, right? If something doesn't have a causal function, then it isn't considered an ultimate truth. And as Rishi points out, both the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, they are physically realism schools, right? You can see and you can touch the ultimate truth, which intriguingly means just seeing the truth won't liberate you, right? Because the truth is based on the object. So very different from Madhyamaka, because for us, the path of seeing, right, the first bhumi, that already now is a form of liberation. But in these Vaibhashika and Sautrantika schools, you can see things and it won't necessarily liberate you. Now, Chitta Mantra, we're going to spend a lot more time with them next week, but just briefly, they have three natures where they do have an ultimate truth as part of it. So one of their natures is the dependent reality, Zhenwang or Alaya, or in Sanskrit Paratantra. This substantially exists, right? This is conventionally real. It's the base for the second nature, which is the projections, labeling or kuntak, parakalpita. These are the appearances, right? So we look at something and based on our projections, we see different things, we project onto this underlying reality. Get very contemporary sort of phenomenological theory, right? And we'll see the Chittamatra comes in quite handy, and we'll see it a lot later on in terms of explaining how the mind works. And then the third nature is what they call wisdom. This is non-duality. So Yongdrup or Paranispanna, this is ultimately real. And their basic argument is that all appearances are actually just creations of the mind, right? There are no conventionally real objects outside the mind. It's actually, and you've seen the movie The Matrix, very similar idea, right? It's almost like we're living inside a simulation. Actually, you might think that's completely crazy, but I don't know if you follow Elon Musk, but he now, been saying for a couple of years, that he actually thinks it's more likely than not that we are living inside a computer simulation. There's a quote he gave. He said, the chances that we're living in base reality, in other words, the real reality rather than simulation, he said, it's 1 billion to 1. So, we may think these Chittamatran views have long since been refuted, but I think we have people like Elon Musk who, well and truly alive in the present day, holding what seem to be very similar views. So I would say, and actually, even amongst the Tibetans, many of them are not really convinced that Chittamatra was ever truly defeated. So, as we said last week, we might say as Prasangikas that we're victorious, but maybe not so sure. So, verse 24, we talk about two kinds of subjects: subjects with clear faculties and subjects with impaired faculties. And what they see would correspond to valid and invalid relative truth. Right, so valid relative truth is the findings of senses that are working, and invalid is the findings of impaired senses. And so we can all think of examples. We all, if we drink too much, if we take drugs, we experience things that are not actually there, right? The classical examples are jaundice, where supposedly if you have jaundice, you see things yellow. Another classic example is this disease called rabrip, which is an eye disease where you see, it's like floaters, I guess, where you see falling hair. Right, and so all of these things, the experience of, when you have this eye disease, when you have jaundice, when you're under the influence of drugs and alcohol, your experience, your perception at that point is considered invalid relative truth in the sense that if you talk to someone else, who does not have this disease, for example, you go up to someone and say, can you see the falling hair? They would not see it, right? It would not correspond to a valid relative perception, a valid conventional reality. And for Chandrakirti, all these other schools, their conclusions, their findings, their philosophies are findings of an impaired mind, right? They're just as invalid. Because if you were to talk to a normal cowherd, he does not talk about, the alaya. He does not talk about the dependent nature. He doesn't have any theories like that, right? He wouldn't even talk about this, atomic moments of mind. I mean, this is all false, invalid relative truth. So, just again, there's another lovely pre-reading, and the one I gave you from J. Garfield, where he gives the example of the mirage. So we'll use this example quite a lot. Just would like to read that for you. He says, among many similes from conventional truth that litter Madhyamika texts, the most fruitful is that of the mirage. Conventional truth is false, Chandrakirti tells us, because it is deceptive. He spells this out in terms of a mirage. A mirage appears to be water, but is in fact empty of water. It is deceptive, and in that sense, a false appearance. On the other hand, a mirage is not nothing. It is an actual mirage. It's just not actual water. Right? So we must be careful to spell this out with care to avoid the extreme of nihilism. The inexperienced highway traveler mistakes the mirage for water. For him, it's therefore deceptive. The experienced traveler knows it's a real mirage that's empty of water. So, in the same way, conventional phenomena appear to ordinary beings to be intrinsically existent, even though they're just conventionally real. They're empty of intrinsic existence, right? But to sublime beings, they just appear to be merely conventionally true, and they're actually empty. Right? For us, sentient beings, they're deceptive and false appearances. For them, they're simply conventional existence. So the analogy. Imagine three travelers on the hot desert highway. Alice is experienced, Bill is a neophyte, and Charlie is wearing polarizing sunglasses. So Bill points to a mirage and says, hey, let's be careful, there's a puddle on the road. Alice knows it's a mirage and says there's no danger. Charlie, because he's wearing polarizing sunglasses, he sees nothing at all and wonders what they're talking about. Now, if the mirage were entirely false, if there were no truth, Charlie would be authoritative, and indeed the Buddhas would know nothing of the real world. But that is wrong. Just as Bill is deceived in believing there is water on the road, Charlie is incapable of seeing the mirage, and so he fails to know what Alice knows, that there is an actual mirage which appears to be water, but is not. There is a truth about the mirage despite the fact that it is deceptive, and Alice is authoritative with respect to it precisely because she sees it as it is, not as it appears to the uninitiated. And so this is very much the approach that Chandrakirti is going to take. Seeing the mirage as water is invalid relative truth. Seeing the mirage as a mirage is valid relative truth. Seeing no mirage, mistake, right? Nihilism, because you're denying relative truth. Another lovely quote on this same topic from Daniel Dennett talks about magic. And he talks about a wonderful book by his friend Lee Siegel. It's called Net of Magic, Wonders and Deceptions in India, about the history of Indian street magic. And in that book, the author says, I'm writing a book on magic, I explain, and people ask me, real magic? And by real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, supernatural powers. No, I answer, conjuring tricks, not real magic. So real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that is not real, while the magic that is real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. So I mean, I love that, because again, beautiful example of the paradox, and we'll come back to it in week 5 when we talk about self. And again, particularly, as you know, Daniel Dennett's done a lot of wonderful work on refuting theories of self, but from a very different, non-Buddhist perspective on philosophy of consciousness. But he ends up in a very similar place to where Chandrakirti ends up. So in the remaining verses, we talk a lot about how we use a relative truth as a method, right? And just clarifying why we say this, because it's a means of communication, as we said before. If I want to teach you the Dharma, if I want to teach you a path to liberation, I need to be able to relate to your world, right? If everyone in the world calls an implement a fork and I call it a spoon, nobody's going to understand what I'm saying, right? So I can't teach a path. So this is why having the correct understanding of relative truth really matters for us as bodhisattvas, right? So any theory that gives us an incorrect relative truth, that's a problem, right? So page 130, just again, re-clarifying this point about mirages, when we say, well, can we use mirages and dreams as a path? Aren't they invalid relative truth? And just to be clear, as Rinpoche is saying, we're not using the dream or the mirage as the path. We're using the idea that the dream is false, right? That the mirage does not truly exist. And as we just saw with J. Carfield's example, that is true. Verse 28, again, another distinction. We're sort of going over this same content now in different language. The example here is the magician performing a trick. So for the audience who doesn't know, they're just sentient beings. They see the magic. They think it's real. It's denzin. The magician sees the magic. He still has to, right, if he's going to do the trick correctly. But he knows it's magic. He isn't attached to it. He doesn't have this problem of true existence, so he's not hooked, right? For him, it's just senzin. Verse 29, the example of the disease of falling hair. So for somebody with this disease, they might be collecting it in the plate, right? They collect all this falling hair, and they say to Chandrakirti, can you see all this hair in my plate? And he sees no hair. And again, as we said before, this is not nihilism. He's not denying the hair, because in reality, there is no hair, right? So very similar language, right? When we say there is no self, we're not denying the self, because there is no self in reality. Now, just because the person with this eye disease experiences the falling hair, just because we experience the self, doesn't mean that it's really there, right? So really important, because I think that's where a lot of us get confused. We think Buddhism is being nihilistic, and it's not, right? So in this way, then, the Madhyamaka neither contradicts nor is contradicted by ordinary experience. Whereas what does contradict ordinary experience? Well, that's the denial of relative truth, right? So here the example is, if someone steals your vase, and a philosopher like an atomist, like a Vaibhashika, might say, well, there's no vase, the vase does not exist substantially, only atoms. Well, then, of course, as a sentient being, a relative person in the ordinary world, you'd be pretty unhappy with this philosopher, right? Because as far as you're concerned, someone stole your vase, right? So that's an example of denial of the relative truth. I think a lot of the other verses are pretty straightforward. Verse 33, I think quite helpful, just saying that this, once we've no longer holding to views of true existence, we then don't fall into the extremes, right? Because we don't have a true sprout, we don't have a true seed, they're not other than one another. And so we don't have this problem that the seed is destroyed, which would be nihilism, nor do we have the problem of eternalism, right, where the sprout doesn't cease to exist. So 34, another very important verse. If indeed phenomena really did truly exist, then emptiness meditation would become the destroyer of phenomena. Right, and as we know, this is something that as Buddhists, we practice emptiness meditation. So this is a real criticism of the Chittamatrans because they are Buddhists. They practice the Prajnaparamita. Indeed, a lot of the early Chittamatra texts were commentaries on the Prajnaparamita, and yet they hold to the true existence of dependent nature. So verse 35, if anything is found, we have found an ultimate truth. Because the reality is, if you analyze conventional truth, it is destroyed. But for verse 37, right, for our opponent who says, well, this doesn't make sense, how can you even explain anything if you don't have some sort of theories of existence? How can illusion explain things? So here the example is reflection in the mirror, because we all know reflections exist, right? If you're a woman putting on makeup, using the mirror, you're using an illusion in the world. Right, so 38, the concise conclusion, because there is no inherent nature in the two truths, there is neither eternalism nor nihilism. Right, and yet 39 says, the effects of action are not lost, because just like the Thich Nhat Hanh story of the origins of the piece of paper, it's all part of our story of how things came to be, right? We're not thinking in terms of an atomic structure of true existence. Instead, we have this web of causality. So one thing affects another thing, which affects another thing. So causes continue to ripple forwards. Another analogy in 40, like a dream. Even though the dream is over, a person may wake from a dream and still think of the dream objects. Yeah, so very similar. You may have a past event that was not real, that did not truly exist, that can still manifest results in the present. We will have, challenges if we talk about, some of the schools about, the Vaivashka, they had this notion of a connector, a vijañapti. How do we explain karma? How do we explain rebirth? But for Chandrakirti, he does not have this problem because he has no theories of true existence established by reasoning and logic. There's nothing to explain, right? Verse 41, it's very interesting. It says, just because for someone with a diseased eyes sees only floating hairs but not other forms, similarly, we only see the things that are a consequence of our particular delusion. I must say, when I first read this verse, actually these verses, next one as well, I struggled with it because, I thought I have a strong everyday rationality, and this idea that you cannot explain things seemed very unsatisfying. But I think that just says just how much we rely on, some kind of explanation of the relative world. Because again, verse 42, we kind of think that, if we don't have true existence, surely everything will become random and incoherent. But actually here, the Buddha rejects that and actually discourages speculation about consequences. Because really, all these theories, if you're worried about good and bad, you're just trying to improve your life in samsara rather than trying to get beyond samsara, rather than transcending good and bad. And yes, it's very good practice advice, but not very satisfying worldly philosophy. But I think that just shows how much we're attached and addicted to ultimate answers to explain our world. Whereas, as Rinpoche said, in reality, Madhyamaka has no philosophy for us. It is a philosophy of non-philosophy. And actually, this verse 42, Rinpoche, is one of his favorites. He quotes it all the time. Often he actually paraphrases it slightly. He says, those who are ignorant engage in bad deeds and go to hell. Those who are ignorant engage in good deeds and go to heaven. Those who are wise go beyond good and bad and attain liberation. Okay, so again, really encouraging us not to think of good and bad and not to engage in all this analysis of the relative truth, because all it's going to do is just fall apart. And so yes, 43, well, why did the Buddha teach all these things? Well, because, means of communication, like we saw earlier, for path teachings, different beings need different paths. And finally, 44, some lovely quotes from the sutras. Just a couple I'll leave you with. If the Buddhas do not act according to ordinary people's acceptance, then ordinary people will never have a chance to understand who is the Buddha and what is the teaching that he taught. And things have never arisen, things have never dwelled, things have never ceased to exist. Yet, for the sake of sentient beings, he said things arise, exist, and cease to exist. They are impermanent and so on. That is also for the sake of ordinary people and in accord with their experience. So this brings us to the end of week 3. We've started our adventure. We've defeated our first opponents. I hope you feel good about it. Next week we're going to meet our toughest opponent, the Chittamatra. So again, I encourage you to read ahead, really get a sense of what are they trying to say, and look forward to seeing you again next week.